The bet was an exercise in staving off the crushing weight of eternity. It began, as such things always did, in the obsidian salon after midnight, when the blood wine had been flowing for hours and the sycophants had grown bold. King Caitian of Noxoria, sovereign of shadows and master of 1,000 hollow years, sat upon his throne of polished jet, watching the charade with an ancient weariness that felt heavier than stone. His court, a glittering menagerie of predators draped in silks and jewels, moved through the torchlight like beautiful, venomous fish in a dark sea. They laughed and danced and plotted, their every gesture a performance for an audience of one, and he was so very tired of the play. Lord Valerus, his oldest and most treacherous courtier, glided to the base of the dais, his smile a thin, cruel slash in his perfectly sculpted face. "You grow listless, my king," Valerus murmured, his voice a silken rasp. "The centuries have dulled the sport of existence. You require a new diversion. A challenge." Caitian did not move, his gaze fixed on the motes of dust dancing in the beams of moonlight that pierced the high, arched windows. Each mote was a life, a world, burning out in an instant. His own life was a mountain of such dust, settled and still. "There are no challenges left, Valerus. Only repetitions." "Not so," Valerus countered, his eyes gleaming with a familiar, predatory light. He gestured subtly toward the far end of the salon, where the great library doors stood ajar. A sliver of warm, golden light spilled out, a stark contrast to the salon's cool blues and silvers. "There is the little human scholar. The archivist." Caitian's gaze followed, though he needed no direction. He was aware of her presence in his castle the way a man is aware of a single candle burning in a vast, dark cavern. Her name was Ilara. She had been brought from the sun-drenched southern provinces, a specialist in forgotten languages, tasked with restoring the Royal Library's collection of pre-calamity manuscripts. She was quiet, unremarkable, by the court's standards. She wore simple wool gowns, her brown hair was pinned back without adornment, and she smelled of paper and ink and dried herbs, not of blood and perfume. "The mouse in the library?" Caitian said, his voice flat. "What of her?" "She is immune," Valerus purred, circling the point. "She works under your roof, breathes your air, yet she does not flinch from us. She does not flatter. She does not cower. She looks at us, at you, with the same detached curiosity she affords a faded scroll. She is an island of sincerity in our ocean of artifice. I find it insulting." Caitian almost smiled. Valerus was insulted by anything that did not immediately bend to his will. Her work is valuable. She is to be left undisturbed. "Oh, of course," Valerus agreed, too quickly. "But imagine the sport. To crack that placid surface. To make that quiet heart beat only for you. To make her, of her own free will, offer you everything." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried through the suddenly silent salon. The courtiers had sensed the shift, the scent of a new, cruel game. No compulsion. No tricks of the blood. Just you, your charm, your wit. Make her fall so completely in love that she would beg you to take her life, just to be with you for a moment longer in the dark. The proposition hung in the air, ugly and glittering. It was the epitome of their existence, taking something pure and twisting it into a demonstration of power. It was everything Caitian had come to despise, and yet, a flicker of something, not interest, but a perverse spark of life, stirred in the cold ashes of his soul. It was a challenge. A new set of movements in a dance he had mastered eons ago. "And what is the wager?" Caitian asked, his voice dangerously soft. Valerus's smile widened. He had him. "If you succeed, I will relinquish my estates in the Shadowvale, and the blood ruby of Asteria, which I know you have long coveted. If you fail, or if you give up." He let the pause stretch. "You will grant me the regency of the Western Marches. For a century." A gasp rippled through the court. The Western Marches were the kingdom's shield, the most strategic and powerful territory under the crown. To grant its regency was to cede a significant portion of his power. It was an audacious, almost treasonous wager. It was precisely the kind of thing that could make an immortal king feel something akin to risk. Caitian looked back toward the sliver of light from the library. He thought of her quiet focus, the way her brow furrowed when she deciphered a difficult passage. He thought of the scent of old paper, a scent of history and truth in his castle of lies. To corrupt that, it was monstrous. But the alternative was this. This endless, suffocating, gilded cage of a court, with Valerus's smug face at its center for the next 100 years. He would play the game. He would win, quickly and cleanly, and put an end to it. He would take the ruby and the lands, and perhaps the fleeting distraction would be worth the stain on his conscience. A conscience he barely believed he possessed anymore. Fine, Cation said, the word a death knell for a peace he hadn't known he valued. He rose from his throne, the movement silencing the last whispers. His shadow stretched long and sharp across the marble floor. By the next full moon, the little scholar will be mine. Valerus bowed low, a triumphant glint in his eyes. An entertaining month awaits us, my king. Cation turned his back on them all and walked toward the library, the warm golden light a beacon in his cold, calculated darkness. The bet was made. The game had begun. He felt nothing but the familiar, hollow ache of a victory already assured, and the faint, unsettling scent of ink and dust on the air. He was a king, a predator of ages. What chance did a mouse, however sincere, stand against the patient hunger of the dragon? He did not yet know that the most dangerous wagers are the ones where you forget what you have staked. His first move was a study in casual power. He began to frequent the library, a space he had not entered for decades, its silence a welcome respite from the court's incessant murmuring. Ilara was always there, a small, focused figure hunched over a massive, leather-bound tome at a great oak table. The air around her seemed different, cleaner. He would select a book from a high shelf at random, his movements silent, and settle into a chair across the cavernous room, pretending to read. He was merely observing, learning her rhythms. She did not startle when he entered. She did not look up. This, in itself, was a novelty. Every other creature in his domain was acutely aware of his presence, their senses tuned to his power. Ilara, however, seemed to have a gravity of her own, a small, dense star of concentration that held her in its orbit. For 3 days, he simply watched. He learned the way she pushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, the soft, almost inaudible sound she made in her throat when a passage finally yielded its meaning. He noted the slight tremor in her hand as she mixed her inks, the careful precision of her brushstrokes as she restored an illuminated letter. On the 4th day, he spoke. "The ink is improperly balanced," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vaulted chamber. "Too much gum Arabic. It will crack the vellum within a decade." She looked up, and for the first time, he had the full force of her attention. Her eyes were not the color of chocolate or honey, as a poet might write. They were the color of moss after a rain, a deep, living green-brown, and they were startlingly direct. There was no fear in them. Only surprise, and a flicker of professional indignation. "I was trained by the finest scribes in the South, Your Majesty," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The formula is precise." He rose and walked toward her table, his movements fluid and silent. He stopped beside her, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her skin. He looked down at the pot of ink, then at the ancient manuscript. It was a history of the First Dynasty, a text so old even he had only read copies. The scribes of the South work in a humid climate. Here, in the heart of the mountains, the air is dry as bone. It leaches the moisture from everything. Vellum, ink, life. He dipped a quill into her pot, and on a scrap of parchment, he wrote a single, elegant glyph. He then moved to a nearby cabinet, retrieved a small vial of amber fluid glycerin, derived from a specific mountain flower, and added a single drop to her ink pot. He stirred it with the quill. "Try now." Her gaze shifted from his face to the ink, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was not charmed or intimidated. She was considering his argument. Hesitantly, she took the quill, dipped it, and drew a line next to his. The ink flowed more smoothly, sinking into the parchment with a rich, permanent blackness, its edges crisp and perfect. A small, involuntary gasp escaped her lips. She looked up at him again, and this time, her eyes held a different light. "Respect. How did you know that?" "I have been alive for a very long time, Mistress Ilara," he said, the corner of his mouth ticking upward in a smile he had practiced for centuries. "I've had time to read." It was the first crack. Not in her defenses, but in his. The genuine pleasure he felt at her surprise, at her intellectual curiosity, was an unplanned, unexpected variable. He had intended to dazzle her with his knowledge, to present himself as a figure of immense and ancient wisdom. He had not expected to enjoy the simple act of teaching her something, of sharing a piece of the endless, useless trivia he had accumulated. He began to visit daily. Their conversations, at first, were confined to the work. He would point out an obscure dialect, translate a forgotten runic passage, or tell her the history behind a particular royal seal. He spoke of the kings and queens in the manuscripts not as historical figures, but as people he had known, their vanities, their fears, their foolish loves. He was careful, editing his own history, presenting himself as a chronicler, a keeper of memory, not an active participant. Ilara was a rapt audience. She absorbed everything, her keen mind piecing together the fragments he offered. She would challenge him, question his interpretations, her face alight with scholarly passion. But the Lyrian Codex suggests that Queen Annalise did not die in the Greyfire Rebellion, she would argue, but fled into exile. The phrasing of the final entry is ambiguous. And he, who had personally watched Queen Annalise take her own life rather than be captured, would guide her. The court chronicler was her lover, he would say softly. He wrote what would preserve her honor, not what was true. Look at the water stains on the lower right corner of that page. They are not water. They are tears. He wept as he wrote the lie. In these moments, the game would recede. He was not Caitian, the vampire king playing at seduction. He was simply a being with a long memory, speaking to someone who genuinely wanted to understand the past. He found himself telling her things he had not spoken of in centuries. He told her of the taste of sun-warmed fruit from orchards that had long since turned to dust, of the sound of songs whose languages were now dead, of the feel of a sea breeze on a coastline that had collapsed into the ocean 500 years ago. He was weaving a tapestry of enchantment, as the bet required. He was showing her a world beyond her imagination. But he was also, for the first time in an age, remembering what it was to be alive. He would leave the library and return to the obsidian salon, to Valerus's knowing smirks and the court's expectant whispers, and the transition was becoming jarring. The cold, glittering performance of his life felt increasingly hollow compared to the quiet, authentic warmth of the library. One evening, Valerus cornered him. "You are spending a great deal of time amongst the dust, my king," he sneered softly. "Is the little mouse proving more difficult than you anticipated? The full moon is only 2 weeks away." "Patience, Valerus," Caitian replied, his voice colder than usual. "A masterpiece is not rushed." But as he walked away, he knew it was a lie. He was not rushing because he did not want it to end. The seduction had become the only part of his existence that felt real. He was building a beautiful, intricate cage of lies for Ilara, but he was beginning to suspect that he was the one who was becoming trapped inside it. He would watch her leave the library at the end of the day, her small figure retreating down the long, shadowed colonnade, and he would feel a pang of something he had long forgotten, a profound and aching loneliness. The turning point came on a night of bitter frost, when the wind howled around the castle's spires like a hungry wolf. Ilara had been working late, her face pale with exhaustion in the lamplight, her determination to finish the restoration of a particularly fragile star chart overriding her usual caution. Caitian watched her from the shadows, a silent guardian he had unconsciously become. He told himself it was to protect his investment in the wager, but the lie was thin, even to him. As she was leaving, 2 of Valerus's favored sycophants, a pair of vapid and cruel fledglings named Lyra and Kale, intercepted her in the Hall of Echoes. They had grown tired of the king's new obsession and sought to create their own entertainment. They cornered her against a cold stone pillar, their movements predatory, their smiles wide and sharp. "Look, Kale, the little bookworm is out after dark," Lyra hissed, her voice dripping with malice. "Does the king know you wander his halls alone? Perhaps she is looking for him," Kale added, crowding Ilara, blocking her escape. "She must be so very grateful for his attention. Tell us, little mortal, what secrets does the king whisper to you among the shelves?" Ilara stood her ground, her chin held high, But Cation could see the tremor in her hands, the rapid beat of the pulse in her throat. He could smell her fear, a sharp, clean scent that enraged him. "My work for His Majesty is confidential," she said, her voice strained but unbroken. "Confidential?" Lyra laughed, a sound like breaking glass. She reached out, her long nails glinting, and snagged a lock of Alara's hair. "We will have your secrets. One way or another." Before they could do more, Cation was there. He did not rush, he simply materialized from the shadows behind them, a figure of absolute stillness and terrifying authority. The temperature in the hall dropped by 20 degrees. "She is under my personal protection," he said, and his voice was not the cultured, pleasant tone he used in the library. It was the voice of a monarch and a predator, a low, rumbling growl that promised swift and total annihilation. "Release her. Now." Lyra and Cale froze, their faces masks of terror. They dropped their hands as if burned and fell to their knees, heads bowed to the floor. "Your Majesty," they stammered in unison. "A misunderstanding. You were just reminding me," Cation interrupted, his eyes, burning with a cold fire, fixed on them, "why I have grown to despise the pathetic games of my own court. Get out of my sight. If you ever so much as look in her direction again, I will personally unmake you, atom by atom." They scrambled away, practically crawling over each other in their haste to obey. The hall was left in ringing silence. Cation turned to Alara. Her face was ashen, her composure finally shattered. She leaned against the pillar for support, her moss-green eyes wide with shock, not just from the attack, but from the raw, terrifying power she had just witnessed. She was looking at him as if for the first time, seeing the monster beneath the scholar's facade. This was the moment. The perfect opportunity for the bet. He could press his advantage, offer her comfort and safety, bind her to him through fear and gratitude. He could be her savior, her dark protector. It would be so easy. Instead, he felt a wave of self-loathing so profound it almost buckled his knees. He had brought this upon her. His game, his wager, had made her a target. This was his fault. The careful structure of his seduction crumbled, replaced by a raw, desperate need to see the fear leave her eyes. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. He kept his distance, afraid that his proximity would only frighten her more. She shook her head, a small, jerky movement. She wrapped her arms around herself. You," she stammered, unable to form a complete thought. "They will not trouble you again," he said, the promise an iron vow. He took a hesitant step closer, then stopped. He wanted to reach out, to smooth the hair they had disheveled, to offer some impossible comfort. But his hands, which had signed death warrants and toppled kingdoms, felt clumsy and monstrous. What comfort could a creature like him offer to someone like her? "Why?" she finally whispered, her eyes searching his face. "Why do you care what happens to me?" The question was a blade, and it pierced through centuries of armor. The answer sat on his tongue, heavy and impossible. "Because of a bet. Because you are a prize. Because I am a monster." But another answer rose alongside it, unbidden and terrifyingly true. "Because the thought of them harming you makes me want to burn the world to ash. Because your quiet presence has become the only light in my endless night." He could not say either. So he settled for a fractured piece of the truth. "Your work is of great importance," he said, the words sounding hollow and inadequate. "And I do not suffer bullies in my own home." She watched him for a long moment, her extraordinary eyes seeing far more than he was comfortable with. She saw the conflict in him, the violence he had just displayed, and the strange gentleness with which he now spoke. The fear in her expression was slowly replaced by a profound and unsettling confusion. She was no longer looking at a king, a scholar, or a monster. She was looking at a man. He offered her his arm, a gesture of old-fashioned, human courtesy. "Allow me to see you to your chambers. The halls are not safe tonight." After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand on his arm. Her touch was light, tentative, but it seared through the fine wool of his tunic like a brand. It was the first time they had touched. As they walked through the silent, echoing corridors, a new understanding settled between them. The dynamic had shifted. He was no longer just the charming, knowledgeable king. He was something dangerous. And she, he realized with a jolt that shook him to his core, was not afraid. Or rather, she was afraid, but her curiosity, her courage, was greater than her fear. He had wanted to make her see him, to desire him. He had not anticipated that she would truly see him, all of him, and not run. The wager had been to capture her heart. He was beginning to realize he was in grave danger of losing his own. In the week that followed, the atmosphere between them was charged with a new, unspoken tension. The pretense of their relationship, king and scholar, had been irrevocably altered. He was no longer just a source of ancient knowledge, he was her sworn protector. And she was no longer just a fascinating puzzle, she was a tangible, vulnerable person whose safety had become his paramount concern. He doubled the guards in the library corridors, a move that sent ripples of speculation through the court. Valerus watched him with an amused, knowing smirk, certain that this was all part of the king's elaborate strategy for the bet. Cation found he no longer cared what Valerus or the court thought. His visits to the library became less about the performance of seduction and more about a desperate need for the quiet sanity of her presence. He would sit for hours, reading in his customary chair, simply existing in the same space as her. The silence was no longer a tool, but a comfort. It was filled with the soft scratch of her quill, the rustle of turning pages, the scent of her focus. One afternoon, as the low sun cast long, golden fingers of light through the high windows, she looked up from her work and found him watching her, his own book lying forgotten in his lap. His expression was unguarded, stripped of its usual irony and regal distance. In his dark eyes, she saw a loneliness so vast and profound it was like looking into a starless night sky. "You seem troubled, Your Majesty," she said softly, breaking their comfortable silence. He blinked, the mask of the king snapping back into place, but it was too late. She had seen behind it. "The burdens of a crown are heavy," he deflected, the words automatic. She did not press, but her gaze was steady, compassionate. "You told me once that a chronicler who weeps as he writes a lie leaves a mark on the page," she said, her voice gentle. "I think a king who carries a sorrow for 1,000 years must leave a mark on the world." His breath caught. She was not speaking of history or manuscripts. She was speaking of him. She was reading him the way she read her ancient texts, looking past the surface to the meaning hidden beneath. No one had dared to speak to him with such intimacy, such perception, in centuries. His courtiers saw his power, his enemies saw his cruelty, but this mortal woman, in the space of a few short weeks, saw his grief. "What do you want, Ilara?" he asked, the question abrupt, torn from him. He wasn't asking for the bet. He was genuinely, desperately asking. She seemed to consider the question with her usual scholarly seriousness. "I want to finish the star chart," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "I want to understand how the ancients navigated by a sky that no longer exists. I want to know what it was like to see the twin moons in the heavens." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "And I want to understand the story you are not telling me." The full moon, the deadline for the bet, was 3 nights away. He knew what he was supposed to do. He should be closing the trap, using this newfound intimacy to manipulate her, to push her toward the final, fatal declaration the wager demanded. He should whisper promises of eternity, of a world free from the sorrows she read about in her books. He should paint a beautiful picture of the darkness and invite her in. Instead, he felt an overwhelming urge to confess. To tell her everything. The bet, the court, the lie at the heart of their entire acquaintance. He wanted to tear down the entire rotten edifice and see if anything at all, remained of the connection he now felt between them. It would mean losing the wager spectacularly. It would mean handing Valerus a century of power. It would mean humiliation before his entire court. It would mean freedom. But fear, an emotion he thought he had mastered, held him back. If he told her the truth, she would see him only as a monster. The quiet respect in her eyes would turn to revulsion. The fragile trust she had placed in him would shatter, and she would leave. The thought of the library becoming silent and empty once more, of never again seeing the focused frown on her brow or the light of discovery in her eyes, was an agony he could not bear. It was a more terrifying prospect than any war or betrayal he had ever faced. So he chose a different path. A coward's path, perhaps, but it felt like the only one he could walk. He would abandon the bet. He would forfeit. He would let Valerus have his victory. He would endure the court's mockery and the political consequences. He would accept it all, if it meant he could keep this. If he could keep her. That evening, he sought out Valerus. He found him in the gardens, admiring the pale, venomous blossoms of the moondust orchids. "The game is over," Cation said, his voice flat and final. "You win." Valerus turned slowly, a look of mock surprise on his face. "So soon, my king? But the moon is not yet full. Has the little bird refused to sing for you?" "I am withdrawing from the wager," Cation stated, ignoring the taunt. "The western marches are yours for the century, as we agreed. Draw up the papers." Valerus studied him, his eyes narrowed. He saw the truth in Cation's face, and it was not the weary resignation of a failed seducer. It was something else, something he did not recognize and therefore despised. "You've developed an attachment," he said, the words a soft, venomous accusation. "The hunter has been tamed by the mouse. How utterly pathetic." "My reasons are my own," Cation said, his jaw tight. "The bet is forfeit." "Oh, no," Valerus purred, his smile returning, wider and more dangerous than ever. "That's not how the game is played. You don't get to simply walk away. A bet is a performance, Your Majesty. And it demands a finale." Before Cation could react, Valerus raised his voice, pitching it to carry across the gardens to the throngs of courtiers gathered on the balconies. "A toast," he shouted, raising an imaginary glass. "To our king, who has so skillfully played his part. He sought to win the heart of the mortal scholar, and he has succeeded beyond all expectation." A cold dread washed over Cation. He saw what was about to happen. He started toward Valerus, but it was too late. The trap had been sprung, and it was not for Ilara. It was for him. Ilara was walking toward them. She had been taking her evening constitutional in the gardens, a habit she had recently adopted. She stopped, confused by the sudden attention, her gaze finding Cation. There was a hesitant smile on her face, a warmth in her eyes that was meant only for him. It was a look of nascent affection, of trust. "Come forward, Mistress Ilara," Valerus boomed, his voice oozing false warmth. "Come and congratulate our king, for he has won his wager." Ilara's smile faltered. She looked from Valerus's triumphant face to Cation's horrified one. "Wager?" she asked, the word a small, lost sound in the sudden silence. "But of course," Valerus said, circling her like a shark. "Did he not tell you?" All of this, the late-night conversations in the library, the shared histories, the oh-so-dramatic rescue, it was all for sport. A bet between myself and our great king. The terms? To make the quiet little human fall so completely in love that she would offer him her very life. He leaned in, his voice a poisonous whisper meant for all to hear. "Tell us, my dear. Are you ready to make your offer? The king has a ruby and a great deal of land riding on your answer." The world stopped. The color drained from Ilara's face, leaving it a stark, white mask of disbelief. Her eyes, those beautiful, intelligent eyes, were fixed on Cation. They were filled with a pain so pure and devastating it was a physical blow. She was not looking for a denial. She was looking for confirmation, and she found it in his frozen silence, in his utter inability to meet her gaze. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The scholar in her, the woman who dealt in facts and evidence, simply processed the information. The kindness, the intimacy, the connection she had begun to feel, it was all a lie. A fabrication for a cruel game. She had not been seen, she had been targeted. She had not been cherished, she had been used. She was a thing. A pawn. A piece on a board. With a quiet dignity that was more shattering than any outburst, she turned. She looked at Cation one last time, and the look in her eyes was not hatred. It was worse. It was a hollow, empty void where trust and warmth had been only moments before. It was the look of a beautiful, intricate manuscript being set to the torch. Then, without a word, she walked away. Not back to the castle, but toward the main gate. She did not run. She walked with the steady, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going, away. Away from him. Away from this place of monstrous lies. Cation stood paralyzed, the laughter and jeers of his court washing over him like a tide of filth. He had lost her. In his attempt to protect his lie, he had allowed Valerus to weaponize the truth. He had tried to forfeit the game, and in doing so, had suffered a loss far greater than a parcel of land or a century of pride. He had lost the only real thing in his eternal life. The silence she left behind was louder than any sound he had ever heard. The days that followed were a descent into a private hell. Ilara was gone. She had walked out of the castle gates that night and had not looked back. She had taken nothing with her but the simple clothes she wore, leaving behind the half-finished manuscripts, the pots of ink, the tools of her trade. She left behind the life she had been building, and the heart she had, for a brief, shining moment, considered opening. Cation confined himself to the library. The vast, silent space was a torment, every surface saturated with her memory. He could see her ghost everywhere, bent over the great table, reaching for a book on a high shelf, the faint, pleased smile on her face when she solved a puzzle. The air, once scented with her presence, now smelled only of dust and decay. It was his world, returned to its natural state, lifeless, cold, and empty. He would pick up a book she had been working on and see her neat, precise annotations in the margins, a conversation across time that had been brutally cut short. His court gave him a wide berth. Valerus was insufferably triumphant, lauding his new authority over the western marches with ostentatious displays of power. The other courtiers, seeing the king's black mood, whispered and watched from a distance. They saw only a monarch who had lost a bet and his temper. They could not comprehend the true nature of his loss. They did not understand that he had not lost a game, he had lost his soul. For the first time in centuries, Cation felt the true weight of his immortality. It was not a gift, but a curse. An endless, unchanging prison sentence to be served in the company of his own regret. He had existed for millennia, but he had only truly lived in the few short weeks he had known her. He had traded that fleeting, brilliant life for a hollow victory he hadn't even wanted, and then lost it all to a cowardice he hadn't known he possessed. He tried to reason with himself. She was immortal. She would have aged, withered, and died. Their time together was always destined to be brief. But the cold logic brought no comfort. A brief time with her, a single lifetime filled with the quiet warmth of her presence, would have been worth more than 1,000 eternities of this. This echoing, gilded nothingness. He thought of the look in her eyes as she walked away. The complete and utter annihilation of her trust. It was a wound he had inflicted, and it was a mortal one. He knew, with a certainty that chilled the static blood in his veins, that apologies would be meaningless. Words were the tools he had used to build the lie, they could not be used to dismantle it. She was a scholar. She dealt in evidence, in proof. Proof. The word echoed in the silent library. What proof could he offer? What action could possibly demonstrate the truth of his feelings, a truth that had been born from a despicable lie? He could send her jewels, riches, offer her a title. But those were just more tools of the power he had used to manipulate her. They would be insults, not apologies. He had to give her something real. Something that cost him. He had to undo the very foundation of the world that had allowed for a bet like this to exist. He had to dismantle the system of casual cruelty he had presided over for centuries. And then, he had to give up the one thing that defined him, the source of his power and his separation from her, his crown. The decision, once made, was a strange relief. It was a cataclysmic, insane choice, but it was a choice. It was an action. It was the first step on a path that did not lead back to his throne, but, he hoped, might one day lead back to her. He called a full session of the court. He stood before them not on the dais, but on the floor, among them. He wore no crown, no regal finery, just a simple black tunic. He looked out at their beautiful, predatory faces, and he saw them for what they were, reflections of his own ancient boredom and cruelty. For centuries, he began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the obsidian salon, we have amused ourselves with games. We have treated the lives and hearts of others as sport. We have wrapped our emptiness in silk and called it power. I have been the chief architect of this hollow world. And I am weary of it. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Valerus watched him with a hawk's intensity, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The bet for the heart of the scholar Ilara was the culmination of this sickness, Cation continued, his gaze sweeping over them all, daring them to look away. It was a monstrous act, and I am solely responsible for it. It was an abuse of power, an act of profound disrespect, not only to her, but to the very concept of truth and love. This court, in its current form, is a poison. And it ends tonight. He then did the unthinkable. He systematically dismantled his own power structure. He outlawed the practice of taking human pets or patrons. He established a council, with seats for the elders of the mortal communities within his domain, to give them a voice in their own governance. He stripped a dozen of his most corrupt and cruel courtiers, including Lyra and Kale, of their titles and lands, exiling them from the capital. Finally, he turned to Valerus. As for you, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, your regency of the Western Marches is revoked. Your lands are forfeit to the crown, to be redistributed among the families you have terrorized. You have mistaken my weariness for weakness for the last time. You are the embodiment of the rot in this kingdom. And you are banished. If you are found within the borders of Noxoria after sunrise tomorrow, you will be hunted down and destroyed. Valerus's face contorted with rage. You cannot do this. I won the bet. I won the power. You won nothing, Cation said, his voice like chipping ice. You simply reminded me of what is worth losing. Now go. With a final, venomous glare, Valerus turned and stormed from the salon, the courtiers parting before him like water. When he was gone, Cation faced the remaining, stunned assembly. I am no longer your king, he said, the words falling into a dead silence. I abdicate this throne. I will select a council to rule in my stead until a new leader is chosen. My reign, and the era of games, is over. He turned his back on their shocked faces, on the throne, on the entire edifice of his 1,000-year rule. He had given up his kingdom. He had given up his power. He had torn down his world. But he knew it wasn't enough. It was a grand, political gesture. It was a public act of contrition. But it was not proof. Not for her. He knew what the final piece of the sacrifice had to be. It was not enough to give up his power over his kingdom. He had to give up his power over her. He had to give her back the agency he had tried to steal. He had to place his life, his very existence, entirely in her hands. He had to make himself as vulnerable to her as she had been to him. It was the only act, the only piece of evidence, that could possibly stand against the mountain of his lies. He found her in a small village nestled in the foothills of the Sunstone Mountains, a week's journey from the capital. It was a place where the air was clean and the people were wary of strangers from the shadowed lands. She had found work, of course, assisting the village elder, a woman who was nearly blind, in transcribing local histories and keeping records. She was living in a small, simple cottage with a thatched roof and a garden of hardy herbs. She was living a mortal life, a life of purpose, far from the cold splendor of his castle. He did not approach her in darkness. He waited until dawn, when the first rays of sun crested the mountains, painting the world in colors of rose and gold. He stood before her cottage, in the light of the sun he had not been able to properly bear for centuries. It seared his skin, a cleansing, agonizing fire. It was a pain he welcomed. He wore simple traveler's clothes, his face pale and drawn, the skin on his hands already beginning to blister from the light. She emerged from the cottage, a basket on her arm, and froze when she saw him. The color drained from her face, replaced by a look of profound shock and guarded fear. She clutched the basket to her chest like a shield. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight, strained. "I have not come to ask for your forgiveness," he said, his own voice hoarse from the dry, sunlit air. "Words are meaningless. I have come to offer you proof." He did not move closer, maintaining the distance between them. "I have abdicated my throne," he told her, the words stark and unadorned. "Valerus is banished. The court you knew is gone. I have dismantled the world that hurt you." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. She saw the way he flinched from the sunlight, the angry red marks already forming on his exposed skin. He was in agony, and he was enduring it for her. But it wasn't enough. It was still an act of power, of a king changing the world to suit his whims, even if those whims were penitent. "That is your world," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It has nothing to do with me." "You are right," he agreed, and the admission seemed to cost him dearly. "It was about me. About my guilt. It was not for you. This is for you." From inside his tunic, he produced an object and held it out. It was a stake, carved from the wood of a hawthorn tree, its point sharpened and fire-hardened. It was ancient, steeped in the old magic, one of the few things in the world that could grant him a true and final death. "This is my life," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. It was not power, not charm, not intellect. It was utter, terrifying vulnerability. "It is yours to do with as you will. You can kill me, and it will be justice. You can walk away and leave me to the sun, and it will be justice. Or, you can take my life, and choose to let me live it. The choice is yours. All of it. I have no power here. I have no influence. I am nothing more than the man who wronged you, offering the only true apology he has left to give." He took a single, painful step forward and placed the hawthorn stake on the ground between them. Then, he sank to his knees in the dusty road, his head bowed, his hands open at his sides. He closed his eyes, surrendering completely to the burning sun and to her judgment. He was a king no more. He was a penitent, a supplicant, a monster placing himself at the mercy of the one person he had wronged beyond all measure. The silence that followed was immense. It was filled with the sound of the wind in the trees, the distant cry of a hawk, and the frantic, desperate hammering of his own unbeating heart. He waited for the searing pain of the stake, for the final release into oblivion. He waited for the sound of her footsteps walking away, leaving him to his fate. He waited for his end, an end he knew he deserved. Ilara stood frozen, the basket slipping from her numb fingers, spilling herbs and bread into the dust. She stared at the man kneeling before her, a creature of immense power and antiquity, willingly burning himself alive in the morning sun, his life summed up in a crude piece of wood at her feet. Every instinct screamed at her to run. To take the stake and end the monster who had played with her heart as if it were a toy. He had objectified her, humiliated her, shattered her trust in her own judgment. The pain of his betrayal was a raw, open wound. It demanded vengeance. It demanded justice. But she looked at him, truly looked. She saw past the king and the predator. She saw the being who had taught her about star charts and tear-stained manuscripts. She saw the protector who had shielded her from the cruelty of his own kind. She saw the unguarded loneliness in his eyes, a sorrow that resonated with the quiet solitude of her own life. And now, she saw this, a being of unimaginable pride, kneeling in the dirt, offering her his total destruction as the only honest thing he had left. He wasn't performing. There was no court to watch, no wager to be won. This was not a manipulation. It was a surrender. A complete and total act of self-abnegation. He had torn down his kingdom, his identity, his very defenses, all to prove one thing, that what he felt for her, born from the ashes of a lie, had become terrifyingly real. Her mind, the scholar's mind that weighed evidence and sought truth, could not deny the proof before her. This gesture was too absolute, too self-destructive, to be anything but genuine. The pain of her anger and betrayal was still there, a sharp and bitter thing. But beneath it, something else stirred. A flicker of the compassion that had allowed her to see his grief in the first place. An ember of the connection she had felt, a connection that, perhaps, had not been entirely a lie on his part after all. Slowly, hesitantly, she bent down. Her hand trembled as she reached for the hawthorn stake. Cation flinched, his body tensing for the final blow. He did not open his eyes. But she did not raise the stake to his chest. Instead, she picked it up, her fingers closing around the rough wood. She held it for a long moment, feeling its deadly weight. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, she turned and hurled it as far as she could into the dense woods at the edge of the village. It disappeared with a soft thud. Caitian's eyes snapped open, his face a mask of disbelief. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "Get up," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was not the voice of a lover, not yet. It was the voice of a judge who had passed sentence. "Get out of the sun before you kill yourself. You don't get to choose the easy way out." He stared at her, his ancient mind struggling to process her words. "I don't understand." "Justice isn't you dying," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Justice is you living with what you've done. Justice is you learning how to be someone worthy of the truth." She took a deep breath, the words costing her. "You built a cage of lies for me. Now you will have to spend the rest of your life, however long that may be, building a foundation of trust. And you will do it one stone, one honest word, at a time. If you are even capable of it." It was not forgiveness. It was not an embrace. It was a challenge. A sentence. A chance. It was a life's work, offered by a woman who had every right to grant him only death. It was more than he had dared to hope for. It was everything. A single, thick tear of blood traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He had not wept in over 800 years. He slowly, painfully, got to his feet, shielding his face from the sun's relentless assault. He was weak, burned, stripped of everything he had ever been. And he had never felt more alive. "Where do we begin?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Ilara looked at her spilled basket, at the simple, mortal food scattered in the dust. She bent down and began to pick up the pieces. "You can start," she said, not looking at him, "by helping me with this. And then, you will tell me a story. Not a history you've read. A story about yourself. And it will be the truth." He knelt beside her, his blistered hands clumsy as he helped her gather the bread. The sun was on his back, a constant, burning reminder of his new vulnerability. They worked in silence, two solitary figures at the dawn of a new, uncertain day. The great love story was not over. It had not even truly begun. The grand gestures were done. The real work, the quiet, difficult, day-by-day effort of rebuilding a shattered trust, of earning a love that had been so carelessly broken, was just starting. It was a task